Officer Marcus Sullivan had been with the Baltimore County Police Department for 11 years when he walked into a situation that would destroy his career and cost the county $11.7 million. He was 37 years old, experienced enough to know better, but apparently convinced that his judgment about who belonged in upscale venues was infallible. One Saturday evening in February at the Riverside Estate venue in suburban Towson, he received a call about noise and underage drinking at a private event in a predominantly white neighborhood. The event was a Sweet 16 birthday party for Kiana Hayes, the daughter of Assistant United States Attorney Simone Hayes, who'd rented the venue legally, obtained every permit, hired security, and ensured full compliance with local ordinances. What Officer Sullivan did next, ignoring documented permits, dismissing witness testimony from venue staff and security, and arresting Attorney Hayes in front of 60 teenagers including her daughter, would become a textbook example of how racial bias destroys lives, careers, and the trust between law enforcement and communities of color. The videos from that night, recorded by horrified parents and teenagers on at least 14 different phones, would show everything. A decorated federal prosecutor, professionally dressed, holding valid legal documents, being handcuffed and removed from her daughter's birthday party, while 16-year-old Kiana Hayes watched in tears. And the complaint that started it all? An anonymous 911 call from a neighbor who saw black teenagers arriving and assumed something illegal must be happening. A black woman in her mid-40s, Simone Hayes, was standing near the DJ booth coordinating the timeline for her daughter's Sweet 16 when Officer Sullivan arrived. Her printed venue contract and permits were in a folder on the table beside her. No crime, no violation, no underage drinking, just a mother making sure the choreographed entrance she'd spent months planning would be perfect. But Officer Sullivan saw her through a filter so distorted by assumptions that he couldn't imagine a black woman as the legitimate host of an upscale event. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. The Riverside Estate sits on 3 acres of manicured grounds in Towson, Maryland, about 12 miles north of downtown Baltimore. It's the kind of venue that appears in wedding magazines. A restored 1920s mansion with floor-to-ceiling windows, crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and a wraparound terrace overlooking a garden with string lights woven through 100-year-old oak trees. The ballroom can hold 150 people comfortably. On any given weekend, it hosts weddings, corporate galas, and milestone birthday parties for families who can afford the $8,000 base rental fee. It was 6:38 p.m. on Saturday, February 14th. The sun had set an hour earlier. Inside the ballroom, 60 teenagers, Kiana's friends from her private high school, her church youth group, and her competitive dance team, were gathered for what was supposed to be the highlight of her sophomore year. The theme was Winter Wonderland meets Hollywood Glam. White and silver decorations covered every surface. A professional DJ was set up near the dance floor. A candy bar stretched along one wall. A photo booth with props occupied the corner. Catering staff circulated with trays of appetizers. 2 uniformed security guards, hired by Simone Hayes specifically to ensure order, stood near the entrance. The guest list had been submitted to venue management 2 weeks in advance. Every parent had signed permission forms. The venue's event coordinator, Patricia Chen, had personally approved the setup that afternoon. The permits, noise variance until 10 o'clock p.m., private event license, food service clearance, had been filed with Baltimore County 3 weeks prior. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Everything was exactly as it should be. But Towson is a neighborhood where the median home price exceeds $65,000, where the population is 72% white, and where a black family hosting an event for black teenagers apparently triggered someone's suspicion. At 6:15 p.m., someone in one of the adjacent properties, a house valued at $89,000, owned by residents who'd moved in 6 months earlier, picked up the phone and called 911 to report a loud party with possible underage drinking and gang activity. The caller refused to give their name. The dispatcher noted, anonymous complaint, no confirmation of illegal activity, but sent a patrol car anyway. Officer Marcus Sullivan received that call at 6:18 p.m. 6A. Career Overview. Simone Hayes had been an Assistant United States Attorney in the District of Maryland for 14 years. 14 years prosecuting federal crimes that required meticulous preparation, an encyclopedic knowledge of federal law, and the ability to stand before juries and judges and argue cases that shaped legal precedent. She'd spent 6 years in the Public Corruption Unit, leading prosecutions against city officials who'd betrayed public trust, 5 years before that in the Violent Crime Division, putting gang leaders and armed robbers behind bars, and 3 years early in her career handling drug trafficking cases that required coordination with DEA agents across 3 states. She'd tried 47 cases to verdict with a conviction rate of 89%. She'd argued before the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals 11 times. She'd received commendations from 2 different U.S. attorneys and trained junior prosecutors in trial advocacy. Her colleagues called her relentless. Her supervisors called her the prosecutor they wanted on their most complicated cases. Defense attorneys, off the record, called her fair but unbeatable. 6B. Education and Credentials. Simone Hayes had graduated summa cum laude from Howard University with a degree in political science before attending Yale Law School, where she'd been an editor of the Yale Law Journal and clerked for a federal district court judge in Washington, D.C. After law school, she'd spent 2 years at a prestigious D.C. law firm before realizing that corporate litigation didn't match her values. She wanted to serve the public. She wanted to hold powerful people accountable. She joined the U.S. Attorney's Office at 29 years old and never looked back. She'd published articles in legal journals about prosecutorial ethics and evidence standards. She'd been recognized by the National Bar Association for her work mentoring young attorneys of color. The Baltimore Sun had profiled her as one of 10 federal prosecutors shaping Maryland justice. 6C. Personal life. At 44 years old, Simone Hayes was exactly where she'd worked to be. Respected in her field, raising a daughter who made her proud, and contributing to a justice system she believed in despite its flaws. She was a single mother. Kiana's father had left when Kiana was 3 years old, which meant balancing a demanding federal job with PTA meetings, dance recitals, and the kind of active parenting that required saying no to late-night trial prep when her daughter needed help with algebra. Kiana was everything to her. Watching her daughter grow into a confident, talented young woman, honor roll student, competitive dancer, youth group leader, was Simone's greatest accomplishment. And planning Kiana's Sweet 16 had been a project Simone had thrown herself into with the same intensity she brought to federal cases. She'd researched venues for months. She'd interviewed DJs, reviewed catering menus, coordinated with Kiana's dance team for a choreographed entrance that would be Instagram perfect. She'd saved for 2 years to afford it. This wasn't just a party. This was a milestone, a celebration, a memory she wanted Kiana to carry forever. 6D. That day's context. That Saturday, Simone had arrived at the Riverside estate at 2:00 p.m., 4 hours before guests were scheduled to arrive. She'd overseen setup alongside the venue coordinator, confirmed the security detail, walked through every detail with the DJ and caterers. She wore a navy cocktail dress, heels and jewelry. Elegant but appropriate for a mother hosting her daughter's event. Her federal credentials were in her car. She hadn't thought to bring them. Why would she need proof of identity at her own daughter's party? The guests arrived at 6:00 p.m., exactly as planned. Teenagers in formal wear, dropped off by their parents, signed in at the entrance where security checked names against the approved list. The DJ started playing music. The candy bar opened. Kiana, wearing a silver gown Simone had helped her pick out, was surrounded by friends, laughing, taking photos, living the night she'd dreamed about. Simone stood near the DJ booth, reviewing the timeline on her phone. The choreographed entrance was scheduled for 7:15 p.m., dinner at 7:45 p.m., cake cutting at 8:30 p.m. Everything was running perfectly. Parents who'd stayed to supervise, 5 of them, scattered around the ballroom, were chatting near the refreshment table. The 2 hired security guards stood at the entrance, monitoring the front door. She looked like what she was, a successful professional woman hosting a milestone event for her daughter. She'd violated no law. She'd obtained every required permit. She'd hired security specifically to ensure compliance with noise ordinances and prevent any issues. 6E. The problem statement. But to Officer Marcus Sullivan, who'd just pulled into the parking lot after receiving a complaint about possible gang activity, the scene didn't match what he expected, and in his mind, black teenagers in formal wear at an upscale venue on a Saturday night couldn't possibly be legal. Something had to be wrong, and he was going to prove it. Marcus Sullivan was 37 years old. He'd been a patrol officer with the Baltimore County Police Department for 11 years, working the Towson precinct for the last 6 of those years. He was efficient, results-oriented, and deeply convinced that his ability to read situations made him a better officer than his peers. His supervisors described him as proactive but sometimes lacking in community sensitivity. His partners, the ones who'd worked with him long enough to see patterns, called him aggressive on calls in certain neighborhoods. 7b. Complaint history. In 11 years, Marcus Sullivan had compiled a record that should have raised red flags at every level of supervision. 17 complaints. 17. 9 of them involved allegations of racial profiling or excessive response to calls involving people of color in affluent areas. 4 had been sustained, resulting in written reprimands and mandatory bias training. The other 13 had been closed with insufficient evidence or unfounded determinations, despite witness statements that told a different story. Sullivan had a pattern. He responded to calls in Towson, one of Baltimore County's wealthiest, whitest neighborhoods, with an assumption that black residents didn't belong unless they were service workers or visitors. In 2019, he detained a black man for suspicious activity outside a Towson home. The man was a real estate agent showing the property to clients. The complaint was sustained. Sullivan received a written reprimand. In 2021, he'd questioned a black teenager walking through a Towson park about loitering. The teenager lived 2 blocks away and was walking home from school. The complaint was closed as unfounded, despite the teenager's mother filing a formal protest. In 2023, he'd stopped a black family loading groceries into their car in a Towson shopping center parking lot, questioning them about theft because the bags looked suspicious. The family had receipts. The complaint was sustained. Sullivan completed bias training for the 3rd time. The pattern was clear. The documentation was extensive. But somehow Sullivan remained on patrol in Towson, responding to calls in a neighborhood where his assumptions about race and belonging had been proven wrong repeatedly. 7c. The call decision. That Saturday at 6:18 p.m., Sullivan received the dispatch. Anonymous complaint, Riverside Estate, 414 Bellwood Avenue, possible noise violation and underage drinking. Caller reports, large group of teenagers, possible gang activity. Gang activity. That phrase activated something in Sullivan's mind. He didn't question whether teenagers in formal wear at a rented venue constituted a gang. He didn't consider that gang activity might be code for black teenagers existing in our neighborhood. He didn't think about the fact that the Riverside Estate was a legal venue that hosted events every weekend. He just heard teenagers, gang activity, and Towson, and his pattern recognition system, calibrated by years of biased assumptions, told him exactly what he'd find. Kids breaking the law, parents who'd rented a venue they couldn't afford, fake permits, illegal activity. In Sullivan's mind, he was preventing crime before it escalated. He was protecting the neighborhood. He was doing his job. 7d. The arrival, approach. Sullivan arrived at 6:35 p.m., parking his patrol car directly in front of the entrance where the flashing lights would be visible to everyone inside. His partner, Officer Jessica Rahman, a 2-year veteran who'd worked with Sullivan twice before and found him difficult, followed him toward the entrance. Sullivan scanned the scene. Luxury cars in the parking lot, teenagers visible through the windows in formal wear, music audible but not excessive, 2 security guards at the door. None of it registered as legal compliance. In his mind, it registered as suspicious. Too fancy, too organized, too expensive for the demographic he assumed was inside. His eyes landed on the security guards, both black men in professional uniforms with visible security company badges. In Sullivan's mind, that confirmed his assumption. Black security at a black event. Definitely something wrong here. He walked directly toward the entrance, his hand already moving toward his radio to call for backup before he'd spoken to anyone. Do you think officers with multiple sustained complaints for racial profiling should face automatic removal from patrol duties in affluent neighborhoods? Drop your answer below. Simone Hayes was reviewing the choreographed entrance timeline on her phone when she heard raised voices at the entrance. She looked up and saw a Baltimore County patrol officer arguing with the security guards. Her immediate thought was that someone had called about parking, maybe a neighbor complaining about cars lining the street. She walked toward the entrance, expecting to provide documentation that the parking overflow had been pre-approved by the venue. The officer's posture was aggressive, feet planted wide, shoulders squared, one hand on his belt near his radio. The security guards, both experienced professionals who'd worked hundreds of events, were standing calmly but firmly blocking his path. "Officer, you need to leave. This is a private event with proper permits." Simone reached the entrance. The officer's name tag read, M. Sullivan. His expression, when he turned to face her, was exactly what she'd seen countless times in courtrooms, certainty without justification. "Ma'am, are you the person in charge here?" "Yes, I'm Simone Hayes. I rented this venue for my daughter's birthday party. Is there a problem?" Sullivan's eyes scanned her. The cocktail dress, the jewelry, her natural hair styled in an elegant updo. His expression hardened. "I received a complaint about noise violations and underage drinking. I need to see your permits and verify everyone's age." 8B. The evidence presentation. Simone walked to the nearest table, retrieved the folder she'd prepared specifically for situations like this, and returned to Sullivan. She opened it to show the permits, arranged in clear plastic sleeves, the private event license issued by Baltimore County, the noise variance approved until 10 p.m., the food service clearance, the venue contract signed by Patricia Chen, the event coordinator. "Here are all the permits. The noise variance is valid until 10. Everyone here is between 14 and 16 years old. It's a Sweet 16 party. No alcohol is being served. We have professional security monitoring the entrance." Sullivan glanced at the documents for approximately 3 seconds. He didn't read them. He didn't examine the signatures or official seals. His expression didn't change. These could be fake. Anyone can print documents. Simone's professional composure, trained through years of cross-examining hostile witnesses, held, but her voice sharpened. "These are official permits filed with Baltimore County 3 weeks ago. You can verify them by calling the county permit office. The venue coordinator is here and can confirm everything." Sullivan's jaw tightened. "I'll determine what's valid. I'm shutting this event down until I verify these documents and check IDs for everyone inside." 8C. This is where. Commentary. This is where bias becomes impenetrable. Where assumptions are so deeply embedded that physical evidence, official documents with county seals, professional security, a venue coordinator standing 5 feet away confirming everything, cannot penetrate the certainty that something must be wrong. Sullivan had decided, before entering the building, what he'd find. The permits couldn't be real because in his mental framework, black families didn't rent venues like this legally. They cut corners, they faked documents, they violated rules, and no amount of evidence would change that framework because his ego depended on being right. 8D. Escalation and witnesses. The ballroom had gone quiet. Parents at the refreshment table turned to watch. Teenagers near the dance floor stopped moving. Phones came out. Kiana Hayes, standing near the DJ booth in her silver gown, stared at her mother being confronted by a police officer. "Officer, you have no legal authority to shut down a permitted private event without evidence of a crime. These teenagers are guests. Their parents signed permission forms. Everything here is documented." Sullivan's voice rose, audible now throughout the ballroom. "I have authority to investigate complaints. If you don't cooperate, I'll arrest you for obstruction." Patricia Chen, the venue coordinator, hurried over, her own folder of permits in hand. "Officer, I'm the venue coordinator. Everything Ms. Hayes is telling you is accurate. We verified all permits before approving this event. This is a legal private party." Sullivan ignored her. His eyes remained fixed on Simone. "Ma'am, I'm asking one more time. Are you going to cooperate or do I need to call for backup?" Simone's voice remained calm, but every word was chosen with the precision of a federal prosecutor who knew she was building a record. "I am cooperating. I've shown you valid permits. I've explained the nature of this event. You have no probable cause to shut it down. What you're doing right now is harassment." Sullivan reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need backup at Riverside Estate, 414 Bellwood Avenue. Subject refusing to comply." That's when one of the parents, Dr. Michael Torres, a physician who'd known Simone for years, stepped forward. "Officer, I'm a parent here supervising. These are high school students celebrating a birthday. There's no crime happening. You're disrupting a children's party." Sullivan's hand moved to his handcuffs. "Sir, step back, or you'll be arrested too." 8E. The arrest, detention. Simone Hayes knew exactly what was happening. She'd prosecuted enough cases involving police misconduct to recognize an officer operating on bias instead of law. She had a choice. She could continue arguing and risk escalation that might traumatize her daughter further, or she could comply under protest and build the kind of documentation that would end Sullivan's career. She chose documentation. Her voice, loud enough for the entire room to hear, was clear and controlled. "I am complying under protest. I am not resisting. I am the lawful host of this permitted event. My name is Simone Hayes. I am an assistant United States attorney. I am being unlawfully detained." Sullivan grabbed her wrist and pulled her arm behind her back. The handcuffs clicked into place, tighter than necessary. Simone didn't resist. She kept her voice steady. These handcuffs are excessively tight. I am not resisting arrest. There are 60 witnesses and multiple recordings. You are violating my civil rights." The ballroom erupted. Teenagers started crying. Parents rushed forward. Security guards positioned themselves between the crowd and Sullivan, trying to prevent the situation from becoming more chaotic. Kiana Hayes stood frozen near the DJ booth, tears streaming down her face, watching her mother, the woman who'd taught her about justice, about standing up for what's right, about using her voice, being handcuffed at her own birthday party. Dr. Torres pulled out his phone, already calling his attorney. Patricia Chen was on her phone with venue management. At least 14 teenagers and 5 parents were recording video. Sullivan's partner, Officer Rahman, arrived at the entrance, assessed the situation, and immediately understood what was happening. Her face went pale. "Sullivan, what are you doing?" "She showed fake permits. She's refusing to cooperate. I'm taking her in for obstruction." Simone, handcuffed, turned her head to look at Rahman. "Officer Rahman, my name is Simone Hayes. I'm an assistant U.S. attorney. These permits are real. Your partner has no probable cause for this arrest. I'm asking you to intervene." Should officers who arrest individuals with valid permits at legal events face mandatory federal civil rights investigations? Let me know what you think. 9A. Supervisor arrival. Sergeant Daniel Park arrived within 8 minutes. He was a 19-year veteran who'd supervised Sullivan twice before and had personally flagged concerns about his complaint history. Park had recommended that Sullivan be reassigned away from Towson after the 2023 grocery store incident, but his recommendation had been overruled by command staff, who claimed Sullivan's record didn't warrant reassignment. Park stepped into the ballroom and immediately saw what he'd feared. Sullivan standing beside a handcuffed black woman in an evening gown, surrounded by crying teenagers, angry parents, and at least a dozen phones recording everything. "Sullivan, what's going on here?" Sullivan's voice had the defensive edge of someone who knew he'd gone too far but couldn't admit it. Anonymous complaint about noise and underage drinking. Subject refused to provide valid permits and obstructed the investigation. 9B. Credential verification. Simone turned to face Park, her posture straight despite the handcuffs. "Sergeant Park, my name is Simone Hayes. I'm an assistant United States attorney with the District of Maryland. This is my daughter's permitted Sweet 16 party. I provided Officer Sullivan with valid permits from Baltimore County. He refused to verify them and arrested me without probable cause." Park's expression shifted. He'd been a patrol sergeant long enough to know the exact tone of someone telling the legal truth. "Ma'am, can someone retrieve the permits?" Patricia Chen hurried over with both her folder and Simone's. Park examined them carefully. The county seals, the signatures, the approval dates. Everything was legitimate. Everything was in order. He turned to Sullivan. "These are valid permits. All of them. Why didn't you verify them before making an arrest?" She was refusing to cooperate. "Officer, I showed you these exact documents. You dismissed them as fake without verification." Park pulled out his phone and called the Baltimore County Permit Office emergency line. He read off the permit numbers. The confirmation came back within 90 seconds. All permits valid. Approved 3 weeks prior. No complaints or violations filed. Park's voice dropped to something cold and professional. "Sullivan, these permits are valid. You arrested the host of a legal private event. Take those handcuffs off immediately." 9C. The consequences begin. Sullivan unlocked the handcuffs. Simone rubbed her wrists. Deep red marks were visible where the metal had dug into her skin. She didn't say a word. She was building her case. Park turned to her, his voice formal. "Ma'am, on behalf of the Baltimore County Police Department, I apologize. This was an error. You're free to continue your event." Simone's voice was ice. "Sergeant, this wasn't an error. This was racial profiling and unlawful arrest. I will be filing a formal complaint, a federal civil rights lawsuit, and a report with the Department of Justice. Officer Sullivan's badge number is noted. This entire incident was recorded by multiple witnesses. My attorney will be contacting your department Monday morning." Park's face went pale. He understood exactly what was coming. "Ma'am, I understand. Sullivan, badge and weapon. You're on administrative leave effective immediately." Sullivan started to protest, then saw Park's expression and stopped. He handed over his badge and service weapon. For the first time since arriving, Marcus Sullivan seemed to understand what he'd done. He'd just arrested a federal prosecutor at her daughter's birthday party. His career was over. Within 3 hours, the videos had exploded across social media. 14 different angles from different phones, all showing the same sequence. A black woman in elegant evening wear, holding official permits, being handcuffed while identifying herself as a federal prosecutor. Her 16-year-old daughter crying in the background. Teenagers in formal wear watching in horror. Parents demanding answers. Officer Sullivan dismissing valid permits as fake. Federal prosecutor arrested at daughter's Suite 16. Officer ignored permits. Baltimore cop handcuffs us attorney for hosting legal birthday party. Racist officer ruins black teen Suite 16, calls county permits fake. The outrage was immediate and overwhelming. The videos had been viewed 14 million times by Sunday afternoon. Federal prosecutors across the country issued statements of support. The National Bar Association called for immediate termination. Civil rights organizations demanded federal investigation. The U.S. Attorney for the District of Maryland issued a statement Monday morning. Assistant U.S. Attorney Simone Hayes is a dedicated public servant with an exemplary record. What happened to her and her daughter Saturday night was unconscionable. We support her fully and have referred this matter to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division for investigation. 10b. The lawsuit. Civil rights attorneys contacted Simone within 12 hours. By Monday afternoon, she'd retained one of the nation's leading civil rights law firms. The lawsuit, filed 3 weeks later, was comprehensive and devastating. Named defendants: Officer Marcus Sullivan, individual capacity; Sergeant Daniel Park, supervisory failure; Baltimore County Police Department; Baltimore County claims; unlawful arrest without probable cause; false imprisonment; violation of Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable seizure; racial profiling and discrimination under federal civil rights statutes; intentional infliction of emotional distress; excessive use of force; handcuffs applied unnecessarily tight; failure to verify legitimate permits despite repeated requests; failure to train and supervise officers with documented patterns of racial bias; negligent retention of officer with 17 complaints over 11 years. The complaint included all 14 video recordings, statements from 23 witnesses, Sullivan's complete complaint history, 17 complaints, 9 involving racial profiling, documentation showing supervisors had flagged Sullivan as a liability, expert testimony on implicit bias in policing, psychological evaluation of trauma to Kiana Hayes. Baltimore County's attorneys reviewed the evidence and immediately understood they were facing a case they couldn't win. Federal prosecutor, valid permits, multiple videos, officer with documented bias history, a 16-year-old victim traumatized at her own birthday party. 10c. The settlement. The county settled 11 months later. The terms were public and punitive. $11.7 million paid to Simone Hayes and Kiana Hayes, $8.2 million to Simone, $3. $5 million to Kiana for emotional distress. Officer Marcus Sullivan was terminated 7 weeks after the incident. The termination letter was final. Officer Sullivan arrested a federal prosecutor without probable cause at a legally permitted private event, refused to verify legitimate county-issued permits, and engaged in racial profiling. Despite 17 prior complaints over 11 years, including 9 involving allegations of racial bias and 4 sustained findings requiring remedial training, Officer Sullivan continued to demonstrate discriminatory policing practices. His employment is terminated effective immediately. Sullivan's name was entered into the National Decertification Index. His law enforcement career was over at 37 years old. He would never work as a police officer again. 10d. Department consequences. Baltimore County Police faced federal scrutiny. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division opened a pattern and practice investigation into the department's complaint handling procedures. Their findings were damning. 17 complaints over 11 years with only 4 sustained, despite substantial witness evidence in 9 cases. Multiple supervisors, including Sergeant Park, had flagged Sullivan as a liability, but were overruled by command staff. Mandatory bias training completed 4 times, but never assessed for behavioral change. A culture that protected officers over community accountability. The consent decree required automatic reassignment for officers with 5 or more bias-related complaints. Independent review of all complaint closures marked unfounded, quarterly pattern analysis of all stops and arrests, with demographic tracking, mandatory permit verification before any event shutdown, real-time civilian oversight of complaint investigations, federal monitoring for 5 years. Should officers with multiple sustained racial profiling complaints face automatic decertification? Drop your answer. Simone Hayes testified at Baltimore County Council hearings 6 months after the incident. Her testimony was powerful, controlled, and devastating. Kiana sat beside her, now 17 years old, still in therapy to process the trauma of watching her mother arrested at what should have been the happiest night of her teenage years. Simone's voice filled the council chamber. "I'm a federal prosecutor. I've spent 14 years working to uphold the law, to pursue justice, to hold people accountable for their actions. I had valid permits. I had documentation. I had professional security. I had a venue coordinator confirming everything I said, and I was arrested anyway." She paused, letting the silence emphasize her point. "I wasn't loitering. I was hosting my daughter's birthday party. I wasn't causing a disturbance. I was reviewing a timeline on my phone. I wasn't violating any law. I was exercising my legal right to rent a venue and celebrate a milestone with my child. But Officer Sullivan saw a black woman in an upscale venue and couldn't imagine that I belonged there." Her voice hardened. "I showed him permits with county seals. He called them fake. I identified myself as a federal prosecutor. He didn't believe me. I explained that security was monitoring the entrance. He threatened to arrest them too. Nothing I said mattered because his bias had already decided what I was. Someone who didn't belong in that space. Someone trying to get away with something. Someone who needed to be removed." She looked directly at the council members. "This happens every day to black people who don't have federal credentials, to families who don't have the resources to fight back, to parents whose children's trauma doesn't make national news. If this can happen to me, with my career, my credentials, my knowledge of the law, what happens to everyone else?" Simone gestured to Kiana. "My daughter spent months planning that party. She picked out her dress. She choreographed an entrance with her dance team. She invited 60 friends, and instead of celebrating, she watched her mother get handcuffed and removed from the venue. She's in therapy now. She has panic attacks when she sees police cars. That's what Officer Sullivan's bias cost her." Another pause. The room was silent. 17 complaints in 11 years. 9 of them involved racial profiling. 4 were sustained. And he was still on patrol in Towson, still responding to calls in neighborhoods where his bias told him black people didn't belong. That's not a failure of one officer. That's a failure of a system that protected him despite overwhelming evidence that he was a danger to the community. The council chamber remained silent as Simone and Kiana left. This wasn't just about a wrongful arrest. This was proof that for black families, no amount of compliance, documentation, or credentials is enough when bias has made its decision. Simone Hayes showed valid permits issued by Baltimore County. She identified herself as a federal prosecutor. She was hosting a legal private event with professional security, venue coordinator confirmation, and 60 witnesses. None of it mattered because Officer Sullivan saw black teenagers in an upscale venue and his bias system immediately categorized the situation as criminal. The permits had to be fake. The prosecutor claim had to be a lie. The security had to be complicit. The parents had to be covering for illegal activity. His bias was so complete, so impenetrable, that physical evidence with official county seals couldn't override it. This is how systemic racism operates in everyday spaces. It's not always violent or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, insidious, built on assumptions that seem reasonable until examined. It's an anonymous neighbor who sees black teenagers in formal wear and calls 911 to report gang activity. It's an officer who sees valid permits and assumes they're counterfeit. It's a system that lets that officer stay on patrol for 11 years, despite 17 complaints showing a clear pattern. And when that bias is backed by the authority to arrest, to handcuff, to ruin a 16-year-old's milestone celebration in front of her friends, it doesn't just harm individuals. It sends a message. You don't belong here, no matter your permits, no matter your credentials, no matter your rights. Marcus Sullivan's career is over. That's consequence. Baltimore County paid $11.7 million. That's accountability. The department faces federal monitoring. That's systemic reform. But money and oversight don't undo the trauma of being arrested at your daughter's birthday party. They don't restore the joy of a sweet 16 that should have been perfect. They don't erase Kiana Hayes' panic attacks when she sees police cars. The real question is, what changes now? Do we finally remove officers after 5 complaints instead of letting them accumulate 17? Do we finally take bias training seriously instead of treating it as a box to check? Do we finally listen when supervisors like Sergeant Park flag officers as liabilities instead of overruling their recommendations? Because if we don't fix the systems that kept Sullivan on patrol despite 9 racial profiling complaints, if we don't address the culture that taught him to see black families in upscale venues as criminals, if we don't hold departments accountable for ignoring patterns until someone with power and resources fights back, then we're just waiting for the next officer, the next victim, the next traumatized teenager, the next viral video. Comment if you believe this should be policy. Officers with 5 or more sustained bias complaints face automatic decertification nationwide. Anonymous 911 calls reporting suspicious activity based solely on race trigger mandatory federal civil rights review. Departments that ignore supervisor warnings about problematic officers face loss of federal funding. And if you think these stories need to be told, if you believe accountability starts with awareness and change starts with pressure, then hit that subscribe button. We're not stopping. We're going to keep exposing these patterns. We're going to keep demanding better. We're going to keep fighting for the federal prosecutors, the Sweet 16 celebrants, the families who deserve to exist in public spaces without being criminalized for the color of their skin. This isn't just about one officer, one party, or one family. It's about all of us and the world we're willing to accept.